JJ, great to have you back. Speaking to you from Paris, where, of course, there are all sorts of questions about PSG that we shall come to in a minute. But can we start with Griezmann, given that he was on international duty with France, and indeed Alvarez, who was on international duty with Argentina? Very different experiences on international duty for these two players that are crucial to Atletico Madrid's season. Who will be the more inclined to be returning to domestic football, do you think?
Yeah, this one's really going to be fascinating because I already feel like Atleti in their start to La Liga, obviously Barca rocketing away from both Real and Atleti at this moment in time, but it feels a little similar to kind of the Bayern and Dortmund dynamic, where Atleti really needs to be making the most of the opportunities to get points up on Real early doors when Real struggle, but Atleti are sort of in line with Real's form and their pace that's being set right now as Real sort of deal with the teething problems of Mbappe fitting in. And Griezmann, watching Griezmann over the international break with France is fascinating because the dynamic for a player who's been key for so long under Didier Deschamps has just become completely different over the summer and the sort of first two games of the UEFA Nations League. I mean, France themselves, Les Bleus, are dealing with a bit of an identity crisis. There's finally some murmurings of public skepticism regarding whether Didier Deschamps is the right man to be leading this team into the 2026 World Cup qualification cycle. And obviously Griezmann has been a key part of what Deschamps has managed to achieve for so many years for France. So suddenly to see him drop off at the Euro was alarming. There were already signs that Deschamps and Griezmann's relationship had become a bit strained, possibly owing to Deschamps' decision to make Mbappe captain over Griezmann. But also just because Griezmann physically, for want of a better expression, just seems cooked internationally with France. He can no longer do the things that have made Griezmann so important to this French side over the last couple of years. You think back to sort of how brilliant he was at the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, where he performed a variety of different roles, to perfection. I stand by what I've said on this show in the past, that I think in 2022 he was helped by the fact that his situation between Atleti and Barca meant that his physical state was much better and much fresher than a number of the players that were in the team at the time. But it feels now that advantage has kind of been lost, and suddenly there's no obvious place for Griezmann in this team, yet France are having real issues moving on from some of their key personnel, and that's not limited to just Griezmann. I'd say there's fewer issues with the handover from Lloris to Mike Maignan, but in defense, for example, the post Raphael Varane era has been quite sobering for the French so far. I know that defensively they were very good at the Euro, but it always feels like they've kind of got three of the four positions in the back four nailed down, and there's no obvious sort of second central defender now to go and partner with William Saliba, because all the other possible candidates have, these disadvantages or drawbacks compared to the other three. And it feels like in midfield, Griezmann, the profile that Griezmann provides, there's still no obvious replacement for that who's ready to step up at international level. Now, sort of how that paints the picture for Atleti coming back and Julián Alvarez coming in, very clearly Atleti are going to play a bit of a different way, and Alvarez is going to be expected to provide, a number of goals for the team and be playing the kind of minutes that he's craved for a long time with Manchester City. But there's also physical question marks over him as well. You look at how he's been run into the ground over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, and you do wonder if there's sort of danger of having one guy burned out just because, he's aging very, very rapidly right now, and the other who's just at the other end of the spectrum age-wise, but, is logically the victim of, the demands being put on him at club and international level at this moment in time.
I think that's it, isn't it, really, JJ? They both play the game in a similar sort of way in that there are no half measures. They give absolutely everything. And it's equally a blessing and a curse. I think you can see with Griezmann the way that he has played the game throughout his career, giving everything on and off the ball, means that surely at some point, he's got to hit a wall. He's got to pay the bill for that. We've got to bear in mind that he's nearly 34. He's 34 in March, so it's not that far off. And I think a little bit like stock markets move on public confidence, I think you can say that about football players as well. And you can certainly say that with Antoine Griezmann, because the perception of a player heading into his mid-30s, when for the first time really he showed physical vulnerability in the first part of this calendar year when he got injured, that definitely affected the way that Deschamps viewed him, I think, for France, is that, if he can't keep going physically forever, what have we got? Because he's this Superman, as you say, I think it sort of really shakes confidence around him, not in himself, but around him, that he can still do what he always did. Now, regardless of what the future is with Griezmann, and we'll come to that, Atletico need him for this season. There's no doubt about that. And you touched on it, JJ, the fact that Julián Alvarez played 75 games this season. And I'm sure that was a huge part in Manchester City's decision to cash in on him, because all the problems that he is going to have over this season, and he will have physical problems at various points because you simply can't play that much and just carry on as normal. And I think that's something that's shown in his first couple of games of the season. Of course, 4 games goalless for Atletico so far, although he's not just about the goals. It does seem as if he could be a tiny bit sharper. Maybe he's getting there. Maybe he's settling into a new team, whatever. But it's not gone unnoticed in Madrid that the fact that this is a season that started in August and which will last to next July because of the Club World Cup. Now, if you can have different players covering different times, and, Diego Simeone has opened up the possibility that they could play in the same team, either with one central and one out wide, or both of them out wide around Sorloth. He's got lots of ideas on how he might incorporate them. And when you were talking about Atletico Madrid catching up, I mean, they're having to work out to play in a very different way because they've had a really profound change in terms of their squad. But I think, given how long this season is, and given the physical difficulties that both of these players will face, I think it's reasonable to expect either of them, rather than both of them, to lead Atletico at certain points of the season. And even if Griezmann isn't the man now, even if, of course, he only came on and played 12 minutes against Belgium in that second game, maybe, just as you were saying in 2022, maybe him not playing all the time at the start of this season is better for Atletico as the season goes on.
Is possibly just what Andy said about Diego Simeone's thoughts about perhaps playing them together, and their fortunes at Atletico being tied together somewhat. Do we have to mention Alexander Sorloth as well, because he's the third part of Diego Simeone's triumvirate of players that could play around those roles? Is it important to add Sorloth to the Griezmann and Alvarez conundrum?
Yeah, I certainly think he has to be, strongly considered, because I think the one thing that Sorloth does that the others can't do is he plays a specific position. He plays a fixed position, is the focal point of the attack. You can't really expect him to do anything other than that. Whereas Alvarez, sort of in his time, certainly in his time with City and for Argentina, he's been asked to play out wide. He's been asked to play as the second striker, which I think his profile suits best. But he's also been asked to play as a makeshift number 10 as well. Whereas Griezmann, you can't really ask him to play as the focal point because he doesn't have that physical prowess, despite the fact that he does love to get stuck in, which, is why Simeone loves him so much, or one of the reasons. But, you could argue that Sorloth is the only one who can really play that fixed position. Alvarez might fancy a crack at it because he will know that that's maybe his best route to scoring the highest amount of goals over the course of a season. But I still think if you're playing everyone to their strengths, it makes sense that you've got Sorloth in that kind of focal point of the attack position where you've got Alvarez playing off of him, and then logically you've got Griezmann, being sort of a supplier for them. But that's almost like a 3-man front line, which is, a lot different to what we've seen sort of Diego Simeone going with Atleti over the last couple of years.
I mean, Sorloth, as you say, is going to be absolutely vital to them. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Of course, he had a brilliant season in La Liga last term. He started this season really well, and I think he's underlined at this top level that he's not just a goal scorer. You look at him setting up the winner for Angel Correa away at Athletic, going back a couple of weeks as well. So I think he's going to have a good time in this team. I guess, Dotun, when we were talking about them being tied together, it's because there are different. Alvarez and Griezmann are at different ends of the age spectrum, but they're both the sort of player that you would consider having the chops, having the characteristics to really motor this Atletico team. And so I think it's been natural to look at it as some sort of extended handover, with obviously Atletico not very keen at the start of the summer or the start of the season to extend Griezmann's contract. Probably a bit of recency bias in that, and fair enough. He's expensive and he's, as we say, knocking on 34. I don't think that's unreasonable. But I think when we look at this as well, if we are talking about it as a handover, and it's not off the table that Griezmann stays at Atletico next season. Of course, we expect him at some point to end up at MLS. But the two sides, Griezmann and Atletico, as we've talked about previously, are talking tentatively about a contract extension for next season. Now, I think the key part of this, given that in the medium term they're going to build the team around Alvarez, is what sort of role Antoine Griezmann can accept. And obviously, as someone who's obsessed with NBA, he'll know it's all about role, especially as you get into your 30s, that you get these star players who can't accept not being the star player anymore. And in his sense, being the star player isn't scoring all the goals. It's being the guy who the team looks to in every situation, being an attacking or a defensive situation to set the tempo, to do the most work. Is he physically capable of doing that anymore? And will he be physically capable of doing that for much longer? So I guess part of these discussions will be informed by, does he feel ready to come off the bench, if you like, to use NBA parlance, or maybe to use, the actual manifestation of what it will be? Or is he someone who thinks, you know what, I fancy going to the MLS and being the best player in the league, which is what he would be.
But the other thing that I think is really fascinating as well about this kind of dynamic is that it's very reminiscent of the setup that made France so successful for so many years under Deschamps, where you've got that focal point in the attack who's Sorloth now, but was Giroud at international level. You've got the young gun capable of scoring goals coming through in Alvarez, who is kind of like the Kylian Mbappe equivalent. And then you've got Griezmann, who is playing himself again, all these years later. And yes, there are physical questions, but, say everyone's sort of fit, in decent form, and it's a big game, you'd imagine that sort of the trio would be expected to, to function in a way similar to, how that sort of attacking setup worked for France and worked to great effect for Didier Deschamps for so many years. Now, the question is, can Diego Simeone sort of recreate that in part for Atleti with these three players? And if that is to happen, does that mean that they need Griezmann to commit and sort of put this potential talk of a move to MLS and linking up with Lloris and Giroud stateside, to bed, for once and for all? Because it does also feel like, internationally, looking at this just through the prism of France's most recent international break, there are going to have to be some very difficult decisions made at the end of this Nations League campaign if things don't go according to plan and Les Bleus don't turn things around. Because if you look at the public sort of turning a little bit on Deschamps now, I think he's going to feel like, if he's still in position, and I think he would have to walk away from the 2026 World Cup cycle at this moment in time. I don't think that the FFF would move to take him out. Does that mean that he sacrifices somebody like Griezmann? And in that scenario, which technically could maybe add a year to his career at the highest level if international football was suddenly taken off the table, does that change the dynamic for him and Atleti? It's certainly something to ponder.